The rain arrived with the darkness, as though the heavens themselves conspired to mark this night as one of endings. In the study of Ashworth Manor, where leather-bound books lined walls too long, neglected, and dust gathered in corners no servant had been paid to tend, Eveline Ashworth stood before her father's desk, with her hands clasped so tightly her knuckles had gone white as bone. She was 22 years old, possessed of her late mother's auburn hair and grey eyes that had once held light. And in this moment she felt ancient, worn thin by years of watching her family's slow collapse. The candles guttered in their tarnished holders, casting shadows that made the room seem smaller, more suffocating, a cell rather than a sanctuary. Her father, Lord Edmund Ashworth, sat behind the mahogany desk that was perhaps the last valuable piece they owned, his face florid from drink, his cravat loosened, his eyes holding that particular brightness that spoke of desperation, dressed as triumph. Between them lay a document, cream-colored paper covered in precise legal script, and Eveline had read enough of it to understand that this was no marriage contract, no ordinary arrangement of the kind that had bound women to men since time immemorial. "You will sign it," her father said, not meeting her gaze, his fingers drumming against the desk surface in a rhythm that matched the rain's assault on the windows. "Master Cornelius Thorne is a prosperous man, Eveline, a generous man. He has agreed to settle our debts, all of them, in exchange for your service." Service. The word hung in the air like smoke. Not marriage, not courtship. Service. The contract specified 5 years, during which she would serve as Master Thorne's companion and household manager, bound to him legally with terms that made her stomach turn. He would control her movements, her correspondence, even her prospects for marriage after the arrangement concluded, should he deem her behavior satisfactory enough to release her with a character reference. She would be owned in all but name, purchased like livestock, like furniture, like one of the bolts of expensive fabric that had made Thorne wealthy. "Father," she began, her voice emerging softer than she intended, and she hated the pleading note she heard in it. "Surely there must be another way. If we sold the East Fields, the East Fields are already pledged." He cut her off, his tone sharp with irritation. "Everything is pledged, mortgaged, promised to creditors who circle like vultures. Do you think I wish for this? You are my daughter, but you are also my responsibility, and I am making provision for you. Thorne will treat you well enough if you're obedient. 5 years, Eveline. 5 years, and you'll be free with a settlement of your own. It's more than most women receive." She thought of her mother, dead these 7 years, who had spent her final months whispering warnings that Eveline had been too young to fully comprehend. "Asterisk, your father has a sickness, asterisk," she had said, her thin hand gripping Eveline's with surprising strength. "Asterisk, it lives in cards and dice and the thrill of the wager. Protect your brother. Protect yourself. Asterisk." But how could she protect anyone when she herself was being sold, when the very roof over their heads existed at her father's whim and Thorne's gold? The rain intensified, a deluge now, and somewhere in the manor's depths she heard a shutter banging loose, a sound like despair given physical form. 3 days hence, her father had said, 3 days until Thorne would arrive to finalize the arrangement. 3 days until Eveline Ashworth ceased to exist as anything more than an acquisition, a solution to debt, a woman whose worth could be calculated in pounds and shillings, and the erasure of her father's shame. Sleep would not come that night, though Eveline lay in her narrow bed with her eyes closed and her body still as death, listening to the rain's relentless percussion against the warped window panes of her chamber. The room that had been hers since childhood felt different now, smaller and more oppressive, as though the walls themselves had drawn closer to witness her captivity. She rose finally as grey dawn broke, wrapping herself in the worn dressing gown that had been her mother's, the silk frayed at the cuffs, and moved through the manor like a ghost haunting her own life. Ashworth Manor had not always been this way. There were memories, faded now like old tapestries, of when her mother lived, and there had been servants enough to keep the silver polished and the gardens tamed, when her father's laughter had not yet taken on its manic edge, and young Eveline had run through these very corridors, believing the world a place of safety and wonder. She paused outside Thomas's room, heard his restless turning, knew he too had not slept. Her brother, 15 years old, with their mother's gentle nature and their father's unfortunate legacy of debt, remained mercifully ignorant of the specific terms of her arrangement, though he understood enough to know his sister was being sacrificed. She had spent 7 years trying to shield him from their father's worst impulses, from the creditors who came with increasing frequency, from the slow starvation of their circumstances, and now she would not even be here to continue that protection. The thought of escape crossed her mind, as it had 100 times since the previous evening. She could take Thomas and flee to London, perhaps, seek employment, disappear into the great anonymous mass of the city. But the fantasy crumbled upon examination. She had no money, not even enough for coach fare. No relatives remained who might offer shelter. Her mother's family had disowned her upon her marriage to Edmund Ashworth, and her father's relations wanted nothing to do with his ruinous habits. Women of her class did not simply vanish and reinvent themselves. They had no trades, no references, nothing but their names and reputations, and hers would be destroyed the moment she ran. By mid-morning she found herself in the gardens, or what remained of them, where roses that her mother had planted now grew wild and tangled. Choking the pathways, and stone statues green with moss stood sentinel over the decay. She touched the face of a weeping angel, felt the cold, damp stone beneath her fingers, and thought, "Asterisk, I am leaving evidence that I existed here, that I was real before I became Master Thorne's possession." Asterisk, the knowledge sat in her chest like iron. 3 days remained. 3 days until Cornelius Thorne would arrive to finalize the arrangement, to inspect his purchase one final time before the contract was signed, and she became, in every way that mattered beneath the law's careful language, his property. 3 days of freedom, if one could call this confined and desperate existence freedom at all. She walked the perimeter of the garden slowly, memorizing the placement of every overgrown hedge, every crumbling wall, as though she could carry this place within her to whatever future awaited. And the grey sky above offered no comfort, no reprieve, only the promise of more rain to come. The village market was small and sparse, the stalls offering little more than necessities. But Eveline had come with purpose to purchase ribbons for Thomas, a small farewell gift that would not reveal the permanence of her departure, yet would give him something to remember her by. She moved through the narrow aisles between vendors, the morning air carrying the scent of bread from the bakers and earth from the vegetable sellers, and it was there, beside a display of faded silk ribbons that had perhaps once been fine, that she overheard the conversation that would alter everything. 2 women, merchants' wives by their dress, spoke in voices that carried despite their evident intention toward discretion. "The Duke has returned, finally, after 3 years abroad with the regiment," said one, her basket overflowing with late autumn apples. "They say he distinguished himself in battle, received commendations from the prince himself, but you can see the war in his eyes. My husband saw him in town last week and said he looked haunted, cold as winter frost." The other woman nodded with the satisfied air of one who possessed even more intelligence to share. "He's refused every marriage proposal put to him, and there have been many. The Rothmore girl, Lady Catherine Wexley, even that wealthy widow from Surrey. They say he wants no company, keeps to Blackwood Hall like it's a fortress rather than a home. The estate borders the Ashworth lands, you know, though I doubt Lord Ashworth has maintained those boundaries any better than he's maintained his creditors' patience." Eveline purchased her ribbons, paid with coins she could ill afford to spend, and departed with the gossip following her like the autumn wind that pulled at her cloak, and she thought, "Asterisk, what does it matter to me if some duke is haunted by war and refuses to marry? My own fate is sealed, and no decorated soldier, no matter how wealthy or well-connected, will alter what I am to become in 2 days' time." Asterisk. Yet the name Blackwood lingered in her mind as she walked the path home, remembering the great stone walls she had glimpsed at the far boundary of their property, the lands that spoke of wealth beyond imagining, while the Ashworth estate crumbled into genteel poverty. She entered the manor through the kitchen entrance, intending to bring the ribbons to Thomas before her father might see and question the expense, but the sound of voices from the drawing-room stopped her male voices, her father's obsequious tone unmistakable, and another voice, deeper, measured, with an edge of proprietorial satisfaction that made her skin prickle with apprehension. Thorne had arrived early. She entered the drawing-room to find them arranged like players in a tragedy, her father standing with his hands clasped in an attitude of welcome that barely concealed his desperation, and across from him, Master Cornelius Thorne, prosperous in his well-tailored coat and elaborate waistcoat, his figure running to stoutness in the way of middle-aged men who dined well, his hair carefully arranged to disguise its thinning, and his eyes pale blue, calculating, fixing upon her with an expression that catalogued her features as he might inventory a shipment of silk, assessing quality, noting flaws, determining value. "Ah, Eveline," her father said with forced heartiness, "Master Thorne has arrived somewhat ahead of schedule, eager to finalize our arrangements. Come, sit. Mrs. Barrow is bringing tea." The tea service that followed was an exercise in suffocation, the drawing room's faded grandeur serving only to emphasize how far the Ashworths had fallen, while men like Thorne prospered through trade and sharp dealing. He spoke to her father almost exclusively, discussing her as though she were not present. His household in Manchester was large, he said, and required a woman of refinement to manage it, someone who understood quality, who could entertain his business associates with the polish that only breeding provided, who would reflect well upon his rising status, and all of this delivered in a tone of such casual ownership that Eveline felt her hands tremble around her teacup, understanding with crystalline clarity that to this man she was not a person but an acquisition, a solution to his social ambitions, and the cruelty was that he believed himself generous, believed he was offering her security when what he offered was erasure, the slow death of self in service to another's vanity and control. The contract signing was scheduled for the following evening, and the knowledge of it hung over Eveline like an executioner's blade, each passing hour bringing her closer to the moment when she would cease to belong to herself. And so she sought what comfort remained in the company of Thomas, finding him in the stable yard where he stood feeding the last remaining horse, a gentle mare too old to be worth selling, even to satisfy creditors. They walked together without destination at first, moving through the overgrown paths of the estate, and Thomas's silence was heavy with the rage of helplessness, the fury of a boy becoming a man yet powerless to protect his sister from their father's casual cruelty. "I could stop it," he said finally, his voice shaking. "I could go to the magistrate, claim coercion, make enough noise that Thorne would reconsider." But Eveline took his hand, pressed it between both of hers, and made him swear, made him promise with all the authority she possessed as the only mother figure he had known these past 7 years, that he would not interfere, would not draw their father's attention, would not sacrifice his own future in a gesture that would change nothing except to bring Edmund Ashworth's wrath down upon him. They walked to the furthest corner of the property, where a massive oak marked the boundary between Ashworth land and the vast Blackwood estate beyond. And here Eveline paused, touching the ancient bark, feeling the solidity of something that had existed long before her troubles and would remain long after. She took Thomas's pocket knife and with careful deliberation carved her initials into the wood, E.A. A small rebellion, a tiny act of permanence, leaving evidence that she had existed here freely, had been a person with a name before she became a possession with a price. The afternoon sun slanted through the leaves, golden and melancholy, and it was then they heard the approach of horses, the sound of hoofbeats and men's voices carrying across the boundary, and Eveline looked up to see 3 riders emerge from the tree line of Blackwood land, hawks on their gloved hands, clearly returning from sport. The man in the lead sat his horse with unmistakable authority, tall and broad-shouldered, his dark hair slightly dishevelled from riding, his face striking even at this distance, and Eveline knew with certainty this was Duke Sebastian Blackwood, the war hero, the haunted recluse, the subject of village gossip. For a moment that stretched into something larger than itself, their eyes met across the boundary, and Eveline felt something pass between them, not attraction precisely, though she was not immune to his presence, but rather a flash of recognition, as though he saw her, truly saw her, in a way that no one had in so very long, and something in his gaze shifted, sharpened, a soldier's assessment perhaps, or something deeper, before his companions called to him and the party rode on without stopping, leaving Eveline standing beside her carved initials, with her heart beating strangely in her chest, and Thomas asking if she was well, for she had gone quite pale, and she could not explain even to herself why the brief eye contact with a stranger should unsettle her so, should lodge in her mind like a splinter, when tomorrow she would sign away her freedom, and such things as the regard of dukes would be forever irrelevant to whatever diminished life remained to her. Evening fell with unseasonable swiftness, the autumn sky darkening as though nature itself conspired to shroud what was to follow, and Eveline descended the manor stairs in her mother's best gown, black silk that had been altered to fit her slighter frame, sombre as morning wear. Though the death she attended was her own autonomy's, and entered the formal dining room, where candles had been lit despite the early hour, their flames casting trembling shadows across walls that had witnessed 3 generations of Ashworth decline. The room held 4 figures arranged like players in a morality tale, her father at the head of the table, already flushed with wine though the proceedings had not yet begun. Master Thorne positioned to his right, prosperous and proprietary, his thick fingers drumming against the mahogany surface with barely contained satisfaction. Thorne's solicitor, a thin man named Crawley with spectacles that caught the candlelight and obscured his eyes, his leather document case open before him like a predator's maw. And an empty chair where Eveline was meant to sit, the chair where she would sign away 5 years of her life in exchange for her father's temporary solvency. She took her place in silence, folding her hands in her lap to still their trembling, and Crawley began to read the contract aloud in a voice devoid of inflection, each word falling like a stone into still water. She would reside in Thorne's Manchester household as companion and domestic manager. She would entertain his business associates and maintain his social correspondence. She would have no authority over her own movements without his express permission. She would conduct no correspondence with any party without his prior review. She would accept no social invitations, nor decline any he extended on her behalf. And upon completion of the 5-year term, she would be released from obligation, but any marriage prospects during or after said term would require his approval, as he had invested significantly in her maintenance and deserved consideration of his interests in her future disposition. The terms were suffocating in their totality, a web of control that would reduce her to an extension of Thorne's will. And when Crawley finally concluded and produced an elaborate pen, offering it to her with mechanical courtesy, Eveline found her hands shaking so violently she could barely accept it, the moment stretching into something vast and terrible as she stared at the signature line that awaited her name, at the space where Eveline Ashworth would disappear and be replaced by a legal instrument, a possession catalogued and controlled. She lifted the pen, her father leaned forward with undisguised eagerness. Thorne's smile widened with triumph. Crawley waited with professional patience, and then, cutting through the suffocating silence like a blade through silk, came the sound of rapid footsteps in the hallway. Burton's voice raised in protest, and the dining room door opened to reveal a figure whose presence transformed the very air of the room. Duke Sebastian Blackwood, dressed for riding, his expression apologetic, yet his bearing unmistakably authoritative, offering his deepest regrets for the intrusion. But he had been riding past, had seen the unusual activity of carriages and candlelight, and wished to pay his respects to his neighbours if he was not intruding upon a private family matter. The words delivered with such perfect aristocratic politeness that her father could do nothing but rise, flustered and honoured, insisting the Duke join them, calling for another chair, for wine, his obsequiousness painful to witness as Blackwood entered fully into the candlelight, and his eyes found Eveline's across the table, found her with the pen still trembling in her hand and the unsigned contract before her, and something passed between them, that same flash of recognition from their encounter at the Boundary Oak, but deeper now, waited with understanding and purpose before he turned his attention to her father with a courtesy that nevertheless held the unmistakable edge of command, asking what occasion merited such formality on an autumn evening. Edmund Ashworth, flushed with the honour of hosting a duke and eager to demonstrate his importance, rose from his chair with wine-loosened enthusiasm and proclaimed that his Grace had arrived at a most fortuitous moment, for they were celebrating the settlement of his daughter's future, an arrangement of great mutual benefit that would see Eveline established in a prosperous household, and the words tumbled out with such transparent pride that Eveline felt her cheeks burn with humiliation, even as she watched Blackwood's face for his reaction, saw the polite interest that masked whatever thoughts moved behind those dark eyes. Master Thorne, less practiced in the subtleties of aristocratic discourse and emboldened by his impending acquisition, leaned forward with the confidence of a man who believed his wealth entitled him to familiarity with his betters, and explained in blunt terms that he had purchased Miss Ashworth's services for a term of 5 years, a perfectly legal arrangement that would benefit all parties, the word purchased hanging in the candlelit air like smoke, and Eveline saw the precise moment when Blackwood's demeanor shifted, a subtle hardening around his eyes, a tightening of his jaw where the scar traced its pale line. The transformation so slight that her father missed it entirely, but she recognized it as the expression of a soldier who had just identified an enemy. The Duke's voice remained perfectly courteous as he inquired about the nature of such arrangements, whether they were common in the county, whether Miss Ashworth had entered into the agreement of her own volition. Each question delivered with such aristocratic precision that Thorne began to shift uncomfortably in his chair, while Crawley, the solicitor, touched his employer's arm in warning, recognizing what the merchant did, not that they were being interrogated by a man whose authority extended far beyond social rank into legal jurisdiction. Blackwood requested, with a politeness that somehow carried the weight of command, to review the contract himself, and social convention left no room for refusal, so Crawley pushed the document across the table with hands that had begun to tremble slightly, and the room fell into tense silence as the Duke read, his expression unreadable, methodical, taking his time with each clause, while Eveline found herself studying him with an intensity born of desperate hope she had not known. She still possessed, noting the controlled precision of his movements, the intelligence evident in his focus. The scar that spoke of violence survived, the strong hands that held the pages with surprising gentleness, and most of all, the barely contained fury that seemed to emanate from him like heat from a forge, though his face remained composed. When he finally looked up, his gaze swept the room before settling on her father, and he inquired with devastating mildness whether Mr. Ashworth understood the full implications of the terms, whether he had considered that the contract gave Thorne authority over his daughter's correspondence, her movements, even her future marriage prospects, effectively making her a possession rather than a person. And before her father could formulate a response, Blackwood turned to Thorne directly and asked what sort of man sought to purchase control over another human being, the question delivered not with heat, but with the cold precision of a blade finding its mark, and the merchant's face darkened with affront, even as Crawley whispered urgently in his ear, both men suddenly aware they were facing not merely a duke, but a decorated military commander and, as Blackwood now reminded them with quiet authority, the appointed magistrate of the county, a position that gave him both moral standing and legal power to examine contracts for evidence of coercion or impropriety, and the balance of power in the candlelit room shifted like sand beneath a tide, leaving Eveline breathless with possibility she dared not yet name. Blackwood set down the contract with deliberate precision, the sound of paper against mahogany sharp in the tense silence, and then he did something that transformed the entire nature of the evening. He turned his full attention to Eveline, his dark eyes meeting hers with an intensity that seemed to strip away the presence of every other person in the room, and asked in a voice of profound gentleness whether this arrangement was truly her wish, whether she entered into it freely and of her own volition. The question delivered not as formality but as genuine inquiry into the state of her soul, and the room seemed to hold its breath, candlelight wavering as though the very air had stilled in anticipation of her answer. Her father's voice erupted immediately, blustering protests about impertinent questions and matters already settled, about contracts and obligations and debts that must be honored, but Blackwood silenced him with a single raised hand, his gaze never leaving Eveline's face, waiting with the patience of a man who understood that some answers required courage to voice, and that courage required time to gather, and in that moment of suspended possibility, she saw something in his expression that undid her careful composure, genuine concern, unmarred by self-interest, fury burning behind his eyes but directed not at her but at the situation itself, at the injustice of what was being perpetrated in the name of legality and debt, and she recognized with sudden clarity that here was someone who saw her not as property to be acquired or burden to be managed, but as a person whose wishes mattered, whose autonomy deserved protection. Her voice, when she finally found it, emerged quiet but steady, carrying into the candlelit space with the weight of terrible honesty. "I have no choice, Your Grace. My father's debts must be settled, and I have no means of my own, no relatives who would shelter me, no prospects that would not leave my brother destitute. This arrangement is necessity, not desire." The words fell like stones into water, ripples of truth spreading outward, and she watched Blackwood's expression shift, something fierce and protective, rising in his features, as he stood with the fluid grace of a soldier coming to attention, his military bearing suddenly prominent in the way he held himself, authority radiating from him like heat as he turned to address her father with devastating aristocratic command, his voice cutting through the room with the precision of a blade. Such arrangements, while perhaps not explicitly illegal, are unconscionable. They reduce human beings to chattels, dignity to commodity. No father worthy of the name would subject his daughter to such degradation. Edmund Ashworth's face purpled with affront, his protests about rights and necessity dying as Blackwood turned next to Thorn, offering with cold courtesy to purchase the debt himself, to settle whatever sums were owed and remove the merchant entirely from the equation. But Thorn, his possessiveness finally naked and undisguised, refused with barely contained anger, stating that he wanted Miss Ashworth specifically, that the arrangement suited his particular needs, and money alone would not satisfy him, the admission so blatant in its implications that even Crawley winced. Then Blackwood spoke the word that would alter the course of Eveline's life, delivered with such absolute authority that it seemed to emanate from some fundamental source of moral law rather than merely one man's will. No, the single syllable hung in the air like the toll of a great bell, final and irrevocable, carrying within it the full weight of his rank, his position, his unshakable conviction, and in the stunned silence that followed, Eveline felt something within her chest that had been compressed for so long it had become familiar, begin, tentatively, to expand, hope unfurling like the first green shoot, breaking through winter-hardened earth. The weight of that single word hung in the candlelit room like the verdict of some ancient and immutable law, and in the trembling silence that followed, Eveline watched as Blackwood elaborated with the cold precision of a magistrate delivering judgment. He would not permit this transaction to proceed, could not in good conscience allow such an arrangement to be formalized under his jurisdiction, and her father's face transformed from shock to fury as he lurched to his feet, whine unsteady, protesting about property rights and legal debts owed, about contracts already negotiated and agreements made in good faith, his voice rising with each objection until Blackwood silenced him with a look of such withering authority that Edmund Ashworth sank back into his chair like a chastened schoolboy. The Duke's voice remained level, almost conversational, as he explained that, as magistrate of the county, he possessed legal standing to review all contracts for evidence of coercion, undue influence, or terms that violated the essential dignity of any party involved, and while such arrangements as this existed in legal grey spaces, he had significant discretion in determining whether Miss Ashworth had signed or would sign of her own free will, the implication clear that he would exercise that discretion against them, and Crawley, the solicitor, leaned toward Thorn with urgent whispers, his professional instincts recognizing the trap closing around them, the realization that they faced not merely social disapproval, but potential legal intervention that could expose Thorn's business practices to scrutiny he could ill afford. Blackwood turned his attention back to Thorn, his courtesy now edged with something harder, and offered once more to settle the debts directly with Mr. Ashworth, to provide whatever sum was owed plus reasonable interest, thereby eliminating the merchant entirely from the arrangement and satisfying all parties. All parties, he emphasized, whose interests were legitimate, and Eveline watched her father's expression shift with calculated speed. The merchant's loyalties, proving precisely as shallow as she had always known them to be, his eyes lighting with the prospect of immediate payment, without the complications of maintaining his daughter's arrangement, without the social difficulty of explaining her absence. Edmund Ashworth agreed with shameful alacrity, already reaching across the table as though to shake on the matter, his betrayal of Thorn so immediate and complete that even the merchant seemed momentarily stunned, before fury darkened his features, his voice rough with rage, as he demanded to know if Ashworth understood he was violating their agreement. But her father merely shrugged, with wine-loosened indifference, stating that circumstances had changed and a duke's money was as good as a merchant's, better perhaps, certainly more readily available. And Thorn rose with such violence that his chair toppled backward, his civilized veneer finally cracking to reveal the possessive cruelty beneath, as he made threats about social consequences, about spreading word of the Ashworth family's desperation, about ensuring no respectable house would receive them, But Blackwood met his fury with Arctic calm, suggesting that perhaps Thorn should consider carefully before making threats against a family now under ducal protection. The words delivered with such quiet menace that even in his rage the merchant recognized he was outmatched, outmaneuvered, utterly defeated by forces he had never anticipated facing in this shabby dining room. Crawley gathered their papers with shaking hands, murmuring apologies and placations, guiding his client toward the door, while Thorn cast one last look at Eveline, possessive, resentful, the gaze of a man robbed of something he considered rightfully his, before departing into the night, with promises of retribution that rang hollow even as he spoke them. And then they were gone, the door closing behind them with a finality that seemed to mark the end of more than just an evening's negotiation. And in the sudden silence, Blackwood produced from his coat a leather wallet, extracted banknotes with the casual efficiency of a man for whom such sums represented no particular burden, and laid them on the table before her father, who gathered them with trembling, greedy hands, counting them twice, his relief and satisfaction naked on his face, already calculating, Eveline knew, how long this reprieve would last before his next wager, his next debt, his next crisis. But for now she found she could not think of him at all, could only stand in the flickering candlelight and try to comprehend that the nightmare she had resigned herself to enduring had been unmade in less than an hour by a man who had walked into their dining room as a stranger and left it, having rewritten the entire course of her future, though toward what end she could not yet fathom, hope and confusion warring in her chest as she met Blackwood's eyes across the table and saw in them something she dared not yet name. Silence descended upon the dining room after Thorn's departure, thick and disorienting, the kind of quiet that follows storms when the world must reorient itself to calmer air, and Eveline stood motionless beside her chair, her hands still trembling slightly as the reality of what had just transpired began to penetrate the shock that had insulated her from full comprehension, and with that penetration came a realization that struck her with the force of cold water. She had merely traded one purchaser for another, exchanged Thorn's explicit ownership for Blackwood's more genteel version of the same transaction, the Duke's money now holding her father's debts, just as the merchants would have, and though the cage might be gilded differently, it remained a cage nonetheless, her freedom still mortgaged to a man she barely knew, and the thought must have shown on her face because Blackwood, who had been collecting his wallet with careful deliberation, paused and turned to her with an expression of such immediate understanding that she felt stripped bare, as though he could read every thought that moved through her mind like words written across her features. He addressed her directly then, his voice carrying across the small space between them with quiet intensity, while her father examined his newfound wealth with wine-blurred satisfaction. "Miss Ashworth, I want to be entirely clear. I have no intention whatsoever of holding you to any obligation, of claiming any authority over your person or your choices. The debt is settled as a neighborly act, nothing more, and you are as free now as you were before your father incurred it, perhaps more so given that you need no longer fear Thorn's acquisition." Her father, drunk on relief and wine in equal measure, barely registered the words, already calculating how best to deploy his temporary solvency. But Eveline heard them with crystalline clarity, heard them and could not quite believe them, could not reconcile this man's actions with any pattern of behavior she had learned to expect from those who held power over the powerless, and her confusion must have been evident because Blackwood continued with careful gentleness. "I wonder if I might request a private word with you, Miss Ashworth. To explain more fully the nature of my intervention, propriety will be maintained. Of course, your brother may serve as chaperone and we shall leave all doors open." Thomas, who had been summoned when the commotion began and had witnessed the final exchanges with wide, disbelieving eyes, nodded immediately, his protective instincts toward his sister momentarily suspended by his recognition that Blackwood had accomplished what he himself could never have achieved. And so they proceeded to the library, that shabby room with its threadbare carpet and half-empty shelves, where Blackwood positioned himself by the window rather than behind the desk, refusing the symbolic authority that space might have granted him, and began to speak with a rawness that stripped away all aristocratic polish. He told her of his sister, Caroline, 3 years his junior, whom he had loved with the fierce protectiveness of an older brother, who had been bound into an arrangement similar to the one Eveline had faced, sold to settle their late father's gambling debts before Sebastian had come of age or gained control of the estate, how he had tried to buy her freedom once he inherited, but the man who held her contract had refused, had kept her isolated and worked her to exhaustion until illness took her in the 3rd year of her bondage, untreated because medical care was deemed an unnecessary expense, and how Sebastian had arrived too late, had held her in her final hours and promised her that he would never allow such injustice to befall another woman if it was within his power to prevent it. A promise that haunted him through the war and beyond, through every aristocratic gathering where arrangements like hers were discussed as mere business transactions, and when he had overheard in town that very morning the gossip about the Ashworth girl being contracted to Thorn, he had ridden past the estate to confirm the rumors, had seen Eveline at the boundary oak and recognized in her carving of initials the same desperate claim to selfhood that Caroline had made in her final letter to him, and he had known he could not stand aside, could not let history repeat itself when intervention was possible. But he wanted Eveline to understand that his actions required nothing of her, that she owed him neither gratitude nor obligation, nor anything at all beyond perhaps the courtesy of believing that his motives were honest, that he asked nothing in return, except that she take whatever time she needed to determine her own future, free from coercion of any kind, including his own. And as he finished speaking, his voice rough with old grief, Eveline found herself looking at him with entirely new eyes, seeing not a duke or a rescuer, but a man still trying to save a sister he had lost, and she understood that his gift to her was not patronage, but the freedom he had been unable to give Caroline, and for the first time since her mother's death, she felt truly seen. Weeks passed in a curious suspension of time, days that felt both liberating and disorienting, as though Eveline had awakened from a nightmare only to find herself in an unfamiliar room where the walls had shifted in the darkness, and she could not quite orient herself to this new configuration of her world, and the transformation, while profound, carried with it an uncertainty that settled in her chest like morning fog, obscuring the landscape of her future, even as it promised that such a future now existed to contemplate at all. Her father, temporarily solvent thanks to Blackwood's intervention, largely ignored her, retreating into his study with renewed access to wine and the society of other gentlemen who shared his predilections for cards and wagers, and while his indifference might once have wounded her, Eveline found herself grateful for the distance, for the space it created in which she might begin to understand what freedom, even this tentative, uncertain freedom, might mean for a woman who had spent so long bracing herself for captivity that she had nearly forgotten any other posture. Thomas reported, during their evening walks through the estate's overgrown gardens, that the Duke had not mentioned the debt in any social context, had not visited or sent messages beyond the single brief note delivered the morning after that fateful evening, a note that merely expressed his hope that Miss Ashworth found herself in improved circumstances and remained available should she require any further assistance, the formality of it somehow more reassuring than effusive declarations would have been, suggesting as it did that Blackwood truly meant to honor his promise of non-interference. And yet Eveline found herself thinking of him with increasing frequency, her mind returning unbidden to the moment in the library when his voice had roughened with grief as he spoke of Caroline, to the haunted quality of his eyes when he had looked at her and seen, she now understood, not herself precisely but the sister he had failed to save, and she wondered if that was all she would ever be to him, a second chance, a redemption project, a means of absolving guilt that no living person could truly absolve. She learned more about him through the servants' gossip that filtered through the village, stories shared over market stalls, and in the manor's kitchen where the cook had a sister employed at Blackwood Hall, and piece by piece a fuller picture emerged. Caroline Blackwood had been 20 when their father's gambling debts had resulted in her arrangement with a merchant from Leeds, a man who had worked her to exhaustion in his household and denied her medical care when fever took hold, and Sebastian had inherited the dukedom mere months after her death, too late to save her, but early enough that his grief remained fresh and terrible, manifesting in the cold formality that had marked his interactions with society upon his return from war, his refusal of every marriage prospect presented to him by ambitious mamas who saw in his title and wealth a prize worth pursuing, despite his obvious reluctance to engage with their daughters, and Eveline felt an unexpected kinship with his pain, recognized in his perpetual mourning something of her own relationship with loss, with her mother's death and the slow erosion of everything gentle that had died with her. And so she found herself one afternoon in late autumn drafting a letter of gratitude, writing and discarding 7 attempts before finally settling on simple, honest words, thanking him for his intervention and expressing her hope that in saving her he had found some measure of peace regarding the sister he could not save. And she sent it before courage failed her, and his reply arrived within a day, brief and formal yet somehow warm beneath its proper phrasing, acknowledging her thanks and extending an invitation for her and Thomas to visit Blackwood Hall whenever they wished. No obligation or expectation intended, merely the offer of friendship from one who understood something of what it meant to feel trapped by circumstances beyond one's control. And as Eveline held that letter in her hands, reading it 3 times in the fading afternoon light, she recognized with startling clarity that she wanted very much to accept, that she wanted to see him again, not out of obligation or gratitude, but from a desire she could not yet fully name, and the realization both thrilled and terrified her in equal measure. The visit to Blackwood Hall took place on a morning when autumn had fully claimed the countryside, transforming the landscape into a tapestry of amber and crimson that seemed to glow from within when sunlight touched it, and as the modest Ashworth carriage approached the estate, Eveline felt her breath catch at the sheer beauty of the grounds that unfolded before her. Sweeping lawns maintained with evident care, ancient oaks that formed a natural cathedral along the drive, gardens that showed the work of both skilled hands and genuine affection, and the hall itself, a magnificent structure of honey-colored stone that might have been intimidating in its grandeur, had it not been softened by ivy climbing its walls and smoke curling welcomingly from its many chimneys. And Thomas, seated beside her, let out a low whistle of appreciation that would have earned their mother's gentle correction had she lived to hear it. But Eveline found herself sharing his awe as they were handed down from the carriage by a footman whose livery was immaculate, but whose smile was genuine. And then Blackwood himself appeared at the entrance, and she was struck immediately by how different he seemed here, in his own domain. The military stiffness that had characterized his bearing at their previous encounters had softened into something more natural, almost shy, as he welcomed them with a formality that seemed practiced rather than felt, and as he led them through the entrance hall with its portraits of ancestors and arrangements of fresh flowers that spoke of a house actively lived in rather than merely maintained, Eveline noticed details that revealed unexpected warmth. A book left open on a side table, a dog's bed near the hearth, light streaming through windows that had been designed to capture the sun's passage across the sky, and Blackwood's tour revealed a man eager to share what he loved. The library that took her breath away with its floor-to-ceiling shelves and rolling ladders, and the scent of leather and paper that spoke of countless hours spent in peaceful reading, the gardens where he walked each morning and could name every plant with the enthusiasm of a true devotee, the stables where Thomas became completely enchanted by a black mare named Nightshade, whose gentle disposition belied her dramatic name, and through it all, Blackwood spoke with an animation that transformed his features, made him younger and more approachable, and when they settled for tea in a sunlit drawing-room, the conversation flowed with a naturalness that surprised Eveline, moving from books they had both read to political developments that Blackwood discussed with her as though her opinions held genuine weight, rather than being merely politely tolerated, to the changing seasons, and what they revealed about the passage of time and the persistence of beauty, even in decay. And she found herself watching the way he listened when she spoke, the complete attention he gave her words as though nothing else in the world mattered in that moment, the way he asked follow-up questions that demonstrated he was truly engaged, rather than simply waiting for his turn to speak. And there was no mention of debt or obligation, no reference to the circumstances that had brought them into each other's orbits, only the present moment and the ideas they were exploring together. And the tea growing cold in their cups as the afternoon sun slanted lower through the windows, and when at last they prepared to depart, Blackwood extended an open invitation for them to return whenever they wished, and specifically for Eveline to use the library as though it were her own. No formality or advance notice required, simply the offer of friendship from one reader to another. And as their carriage rolled back down the tree-lined drive, Eveline recognized with startling clarity that she wanted very much to return, that something in Blackwood's presence made her feel seen in a way she had not experienced since her mother's death, and the realization both thrilled and unsettled her, suggesting as it did that her heart was already beginning to orient itself toward a future she had not dared to imagine. A pattern developed over the months that followed, subtle as the turning of seasons and just as inevitable, a rhythm of weekly visits that became as essential to Eveline's existence as breathing, and she found herself riding to Blackwood Hall, sometimes with Thomas but increasingly alone, propriety carefully managed by the presence of Mrs. Henshaw, Blackwood's housekeeper, who had a talent for being present enough to satisfy convention while remaining unobtrusive enough to allow genuine conversation to unfold in the library, where Eveline and the Duke spent hours that seemed to exist outside normal time, talking with an openness that surprised them both, and gradually, in increments so small she barely noticed their accumulation until suddenly the intimacy between them had become profound. Blackwood revealed more of himself, the war experiences that still woke him in the night, the faces of men he'd commanded who had not returned, the strange isolation he'd felt since coming home to find that the society he'd left behind now seemed trivial and incomprehensible, their concerns about fashion and gossip and social positioning utterly divorced from the realities he'd witnessed, and his difficulty connecting with their expectations, with the marriage-minded mothers who saw only his title and wealth, and could not fathom that he carried ghosts in his chest where a heart should be, and Eveline in turn shared her own trapped feeling, the years of watching her father's dissolution and being powerless to prevent it, her mother's death that had taken with it all warmth from the Ashworth manor, and her love of poetry, which had been her refuge when the walls of her life closed in. And there came a particular afternoon in deep winter, when snow lay heavy on the grounds, and the library fire cast dancing shadows across the shelves, and Blackwood asked if she would read aloud from a volume of sonnets she'd been studying, and as her voice filled the quiet room, speaking of love and loss and the persistence of beauty in a world that seemed designed to destroy it, she looked up to find him watching her with an expression so unguarded, so full of something she dared not name, that her voice faltered and the words died on her lips, and in that moment of suspended silence she realized with a clarity that was almost painful that she was falling in love with him, had perhaps been falling for months without acknowledging it, and the realization brought immediate fear rushing in its wake because he could never see her as equal. She told herself she was his charity case, his redemption project, the woman he'd saved as penance for the sister he couldn't save, and whatever tenderness he showed her was surely born of that guilt rather than genuine feeling, and how could she burden him with her hopeless affection when he had already given her so much, when she owed him everything, including the very freedom to sit here in his library and read his books and pretend for a few hours each week that she was something other than an impoverished dependent whose father had tried to sell her like livestock. And so she closed the book carefully, her hands steady through sheer force of will, and changed the subject to something safer, and if Blackwood noticed her retreat, he was too much a gentleman to remark upon it, though something in his eyes suggested he saw more than she wished, understood more than she could bear, and she left earlier than usual that afternoon, pleading a headache that was not entirely fabricated, her heart beating too fast and her thoughts in dangerous disarray, and all the way home through the snow-silent landscape she fought against the truth she could no longer deny, that she loved Sebastian Blackwood with a depth that terrified her, and that loving him while believing he could never love her in return would surely destroy whatever peace she had managed to build in the ruins of her life. Crisis arrived with spring, as though the season of renewal carried some cruel irony that transformed hope into devastation, and Eveline was sitting in the morning room when her father summoned her, his face already flushed with the particular combination of shame and defiance that she had learned to recognize as the prelude to disaster, and his words confirmed her worst fears. He had gambled again, lost heavily at cards over the course of several nights in London, and the debts this time were catastrophic, far exceeding what Blackwood had settled before, and creditors would take the estate within the month, seize everything that could be sold, and Thomas would lose not only his home but his chance at education, for the modest fund their mother had left for his schooling would be consumed by the ravenous debts, and as her father spoke, making excuses and blaming luck and the dishonesty of other players, Eveline felt a familiar numbness settle over her, the protective coldness that had carried her through previous crises But underneath it ran a current of desperate calculation. What could be saved? How Thomas might be protected? What options remained to someone with no money and no power, except the single dangerous option she refused to consider? And for days she turned the problem over in her mind, her visits to Blackwood Hall continuing but shadowed now by knowledge she kept hidden, and she considered appealing to the Duke, asking for his help once more, but the thought made her physically ill with shame, because she could not bear to be forever in his debt, forever the woman he had to rescue, forever unequal, and her pride, perhaps foolish but essential to her sense of self, warred with her love for Thomas and lost, and so she made a different choice, one that felt like both courage and cowardice. She would seek employment far away, remove herself from the situation, and send what money she could earn back to help Thomas. And she applied to be a governess in a distant county, providing references from the vicar who had taught her as a child, and from Mrs. Henshaw, who had observed her during her visits to Blackwood Hall, and the offer came with surprising speed. A position in Northumberland with a family of moderate means, seeking someone to educate their 3 daughters, and the salary was modest but would at least provide something. And she told no one except Thomas, who was devastated, his young face crumpling with grief and rage at his own helplessness, and she made him promise not to reveal her plans until after she had gone, fearing their father might try to stop her, or worse, might try to sell her again to settle his debts. And then she went to Blackwood Hall one final time, carrying the books she had borrowed carefully, wrapped against the spring rain. And when she entered the library where they had spent so many hours, Blackwood looked up from his desk and his expression shifted immediately. That uncanny ability he had to read her, making it impossible to hide her distress, and he asked what was wrong with such gentle concern that she nearly broke, nearly confessed everything. But instead she simply said she had come to return his books and to say goodbye, that she was leaving, accepting a position elsewhere, and the way his face went still, the careful blankness that descended over his features, even as something desperate flickered in his eyes, told her that her departure wounded him, though he was too much a gentleman to say so, and he asked if this was truly what she wished, his voice steady despite the tension in his jaw, and she lied and said yes because the truth was too complicated and too painful, and he nodded slowly and said he would not presume to question her choice, that he respected her right to determine her own path, and the farewell that followed was excruciating in its restraint, both of them maintaining the careful distance that propriety demanded, even as everything in her screamed to tell him the truth, to admit that she was leaving not because she wanted to, but because she could not bear to need him again, could not bear to be forever the woman he saved, rather than the woman he might love. And when she left Blackwood Hall that afternoon, the rain had intensified into a downpour that seemed to weep for everything she was walking away from, and she did not look back, because she knew if she did, her resolve would shatter completely. Eveline's last night at the manor unfolded with the surreal quality of a dream from which she could not wake. Her few possessions laid out on the bed in the room where she had spent her entire life, the meager collection of belongings that represented 22 years of existence, fitting easily into a single trunk. Her mother's pearl earrings, 3 dresses that had been mended so many times, the original fabric was barely visible beneath the repairs, a volume of poetry given to her on her 16th birthday, the ribbons she had bought for Thomas that day at the market, when her world had been about to collapse into the nightmare of Thorne's contract, and as she folded each item with mechanical precision, her mind kept circling back to the afternoon's devastating farewell at Blackwood Hall, the careful restraint in Sebastian's voice when he had respected her choice to leave, the way something had died in his eyes even as he maintained his perfect gentleman's composure, and she told herself again that this was right, that removing herself from his life was the only way to preserve what remained of her dignity. But the argument felt hollow now, felt like cowardice, dressed up as pride, and she was standing at the window watching rain begin to fall against the dark glass when Thomas burst into her room without knocking, his young face flushed and his eyes bright with something between fury and hope, and he thrust a letter at her, his words tumbling over themselves. "He's done it again, Evie. Blackwood has paid Father's debts, all of them. I saw the solicitor leaving and I followed him and made him tell me. It was supposed to be anonymous, but I insisted, and Father doesn't even know yet. He's passed out drunk in his study, and you can't leave now. You can't. Don't you see what this means?" And Eveline took the letter with shaking hands, read the formal language that confirmed Thomas's words, saw the staggering sum that Sebastian had paid to settle her father's catastrophic gambling losses, and the emotions that crashed through her were so conflicted she couldn't name them all. Gratitude, yes, but also humiliation that cut like a blade, and love that made her chest ache, but underneath it all a rising tide of anger, because how dare he rescue her again without asking, without giving her the choice, without understanding that his constant intervention made her feel like a child rather than a woman, made her feel forever dependent rather than equal, and before she fully understood what she was doing, she had thrown a cloak over her nightdress and was running through the rain toward Blackwood Hall, her feet flying over the familiar path while Thomas called after her, and she didn't stop until she was pounding on the great door of the hall, and when the startled butler opened it, she pushed past him into the entrance hall, where Sebastian was descending the stairs, clearly roused from bed by the commotion, his shirt half-buttoned and his hair disheveled, and concern immediate on his face when he saw her soaked and trembling, and all the careful restraint she had maintained, all the proper distance she had tried to preserve, shattered completely as she demanded to know why. Why did he keep saving her? Why couldn't he let her manage her own life? Why did he insist on making her forever in his debt? And her voice broke on the words, but she didn't care. Didn't care that the servants were watching or that she was making a scene, and Sebastian dismissed them with a gesture and drew her into the library, closing the door. And when he turned to face her, she saw that his own composure had finally cracked, saw something raw and desperate in his expression as he said quietly, "You think I do this out of pity? You think I intervene in your life because I see you as a charity case, as some project of redemption?" And she accused him of exactly that, the words harsh because her heart was breaking. And that was when he finally broke, his voice rising not with anger but with passion, as he confessed, "I love you, Eveline. I have loved you from the moment I saw you carving your initials into that oak tree like an act of defiance against a world that sought to erase you, and everything I have done has been because the thought of you suffering is unbearable to me, because you deserve more than the hand you were dealt, because you are the bravest, most intelligent, most remarkable woman I have ever known, and I could not speak because I feared you would think my affection was just another obligation, another debt you owed, and I wanted you to come to me freely if you came at all, wanted you to choose me not because I had purchased your father's debts, but because your heart called to mine, and if that makes me a fool, then I am a fool. But I will not apologize for loving you, even if that love is not returned." The silence that followed Sebastian's confession stretched between them like something alive and trembling, the rain still drumming against the library windows while they stood surrounded by books that had witnessed so many of their careful conversations, and Eveline felt something break open inside her chest, all the walls she had constructed to protect herself, crumbling under the weight of his words, and she realized that her pride had been both her protection and her prison, that in refusing to be rescued, she had denied herself the very thing she most wanted, and when she finally spoke, her voice was raw with emotion. "You think I accused you of pity because I don't understand your feelings? Sebastian, I have loved you for months, loved you so deeply it terrified me, because I could not bear to be forever unequal, forever the woman you saved, rather than the woman you chose, and every act of rescue felt like another weight added to scales that could never balance, another debt that made me less your equal and more your obligation." And she saw his expression transform, hope and anguish mingling in his eyes as he took a step toward her, and she continued, the words spilling out now that the dam had broken, "I convinced myself that leaving was the brave choice, that removing myself from your life would free us both, but it was cowardice, dressed as pride, and I see that now, see that I was so afraid of being unequal that I denied us both the chance to be partners." And Sebastian crossed the remaining distance between them in 2 strides, his hands coming up to frame her face with such tenderness that tears spilled over her cheeks, and he said with fierce intensity, "You have never been unequal, Eveline, not for a single moment. You have always been my superior in courage and grace and strength, and the debts I settled were never about you owing me anything. They were about removing the obstacles that kept you trapped, about giving you the freedom to choose your own path, and if that path led away from me, then I would have borne it, because your freedom mattered more than my heart." And his thumbs brushed away her tears as he continued, I would rather let you go and spend the rest of my life loving you from a distance than have you stay out of obligation. But God help me, Eveline. I am asking now, asking if there is any chance you might want to stay, not as someone in my debt, but as my partner, as my wife, as the woman I will spend every day for the rest of my life proving myself worthy of. And Eveline understood in that moment that true freedom was not refusing help or rejecting connection, but rather the power to choose. And she chose him, chose this love that had grown between them through shared books and quiet conversations, and the gradual revelation of two scarred hearts learning to trust again. And she said yes, the word simple and transformative. And when he kissed her, it was tender and passionate at once, a claim and a question and a promise. And the rain continued to fall, but neither of them noticed, because they had finally found shelter in each other. And when they finally drew apart, breathless and trembling, Sebastian pressed his forehead to hers and whispered that he would spend every day making sure she never regretted choosing him. And she laughed through her tears and told him that she had been choosing him for months without realizing it, that every visit to Blackwood Hall had been her heart's way of saying yes before her mind caught up. And they stood there in the library where they had fallen in love, both of them soaked from the rain and radiant with the knowledge that the hardest part was over, that everything else would be built on this foundation of chosen love rather than obligation, and the future opened before them not as a burden but as a gift they would unwrap together. The announcement of their engagement swept through the county like wildfire, and Eveline discovered that trading one form of scrutiny for another was perhaps inevitable, though now at least she faced society's judgment with Sebastian at her side, his steadfast presence a shield against the whispers that followed them through drawing rooms and assembly halls, whispers about the impoverished Ashworth girl who had caught a duke, speculation about what arts she must have employed to secure such an advantageous match, knowing looks that suggested she had traded one form of obligation for another. And though Sebastian's fury at such insinuations was barely contained, Eveline found herself strangely unmoved by the gossip, because she knew the truth of what lay between them, knew that their love had been built through quiet conversations and shared vulnerability rather than calculation or desperation. Her father, predictably, attempted to claim credit for the match. His sudden appearances at Blackwood Hall, accompanied by transparent efforts to position himself as the architect of his daughter's good fortune, and Eveline watched with detached curiosity as Sebastian deployed his aristocratic authority like a weapon, his dismissal of her father so cold and absolute that the older man retreated with uncharacteristic speed. And when Sebastian insisted that Thomas would live with them at Blackwood Hall, would receive the education and opportunities he deserved as Eveline's beloved brother, rather than as a dependent asking for charity, she felt another piece of her old life's weight lift from her shoulders. The wedding preparations consumed weeks that might have been stressful, but were instead filled with small joys, selecting flowers for the chapel, deciding which rooms would be hers and which theirs, learning the names of servants who would become more family than staff. And through it all, Sebastian remained attentive to her wishes, insisting that this wedding be what she wanted rather than what society expected. And so they planned something intimate and true rather than grand and performative. One afternoon in late summer, when the social obligations had become particularly exhausting, Sebastian took her hand and led her away from Blackwood Hall, through the gardens and across the fields to the boundary oak where they had first laid eyes on each other, and Eveline gasped when she saw what he had done. A beautiful bench now sat beneath the ancient tree's spreading branches, its back carved with delicate scrollwork and an inscription that read simply, "The date of that first encounter," and when she turned to him with tears in her eyes, he admitted with endearing sheepishness that his ride past that day had not been the accident he had implied, that he had seen her in town that morning buying ribbons and had been so captivated by the fierce grace in her bearing, despite her obvious distress, that he had deliberately ridden past the boundary oak, hoping for another glimpse of her, and they laughed together at this revelation, at the knowledge that perhaps fate had been working in their favor even then. And as they sat together on the bench with the summer light filtering through leaves that had witnessed the beginning of their story, Eveline felt the last of her fears dissolve, because she understood now that their love was not something she had fallen into by chance or desperation, but something they had both been moving toward from that very first moment of recognition. The wedding took place on an October afternoon when the world seemed suspended between summer's warmth and winter's approach, and Eveline had insisted on intimacy rather than grandeur, had chosen to marry Sebastian in the small chapel on the Blackwood estate, rather than in the cathedral where society would have expected such a union to be celebrated, and as she stood in the vestibule with Thomas at her side, her brother looking unexpectedly grown in his formal attire, his eyes bright with emotion, she felt no nervousness, only a profound certainty that she was walking toward the life she had chosen rather than the one that had been chosen for her. The chapel was filled not with the glittering masses of the ton, but with the few people who truly mattered. Mrs. Pemberton, the Blackwood housekeeper who had become more mother than servant, Dr. Harrison, who had attended Caroline Blackwood in her final days and whose friendship with Sebastian ran deep. Several women from the refuge Eveline had already begun planning, their presence a testament to the work she and Sebastian would do together, and a handful of Sebastian's military companions, men who understood what he had survived and what his happiness meant. Autumn light streamed through the ancient stained glass windows, casting patterns of amber and crimson across the stone floor, and when the music began and Eveline walked down the short aisle, her hand resting lightly on Thomas's arm, she saw Sebastian turn toward her, and the expression on his face, wonder and gratitude and love, so fierce it was almost painful, made her breath catch in her throat. The ceremony itself seemed both eternal and instantaneous, the words of the service taking on weight and meaning because they were true, because she was promising herself to this man not out of obligation or desperation, but from the deepest freedom of choice. And when Sebastian took her hand to slip the ring onto her finger, his touch was gentle and reverent, and she felt the final chains of her old life fall away, because she understood now that she was truly free, not free from him, but free because she had chosen him, had claimed this love as her own. The celebration that followed was warm and genuine, laughter echoing through Blackwood Hall's great room where tables had been set with seasonal flowers and the meal was shared rather than served in formal courses, and when Thomas rose to offer a toast, his voice cracking with emotion as he thanked Sebastian, not for saving his sister but for seeing her worth, for recognizing in her what Thomas had always known was there, Eveline felt tears slip down her cheeks and looked across the table to find Sebastian's eyes bright with his own unshed tears. The evening deepened into night, guests departing with warm embraces and genuine joy, and when Eveline and Sebastian finally climbed the stairs to the chambers that were now theirs together, she felt no fear, only anticipation and trust, and as he closed the door behind them and drew her into his arms, she knew that what they would share this night was not an obligation fulfilled but a gift freely given, a celebration of the love they had built through patience and understanding. And in his tender touch and whispered words of devotion, she found the final answer to every question that had haunted her, found that true freedom and true love were not opposites but two names for the same transformative grace. 2 years passed, and in that time Eveline discovered that transformation was not a single moment of revelation, but rather an accumulation of days lived in freedom and purpose, and she had become the Duchess Blackwood in name and social standing, yes, but more importantly she had become fully herself in ways she had never imagined possible when she stood trembling in her father's study with a contract laid before her like a death sentence. The eastern wing of Blackwood Hall had been converted into a refuge for young women escaping coercive arrangements, its comfortable rooms and trained staff, funded by Sebastian's wealth, but animated by Eveline's tireless advocacy, and she had learned to wield her title as a tool for change, had discovered that society's doors opened more readily to a duchess with a cause than they ever would have for a desperate girl, with only her conscience to guide her, and in the 2 years since her marriage, 14 women had found sanctuary within those walls, had been given time and resources to discover what they wanted from their lives rather than what had been demanded of them. Thomas had flourished at Cambridge, his natural brilliance given room to develop, and his letters home were filled with passionate discourse about legal reform and social justice, and Eveline saw in her brother's determination the same fire that had burned in her during those dark days when she had no power to change her circumstances, except now he had the education and opportunity to channel that fire into meaningful action. Her relationship with Sebastian had deepened in ways that still surprised her, the passion of their early love maturing into something richer and more complex, a partnership built on mutual respect and genuine equality, and she noticed how he sought her counsel on estate matters, how he listened when she spoke about the refugee's needs, how he had learned to share not just his thoughts but his vulnerabilities, and she understood that healing was something they had given each other through the patient work of truly being known. One evening in late autumn, when the anniversary of Caroline's death approached with its familiar weight of sorrow, Eveline found Sebastian in his study long past midnight, standing before the window with his shoulders rigid and his hands clenched, and she went to him without speaking, simply wrapped her arms around him from behind and held him as the grief he usually kept. Contained finally broke free in quiet, wrenching sobs, and she felt honored that he trusted her enough to witness this pain, to share the burden of a loss that could never be fully resolved, but could perhaps be gradually transformed through love and remembrance. They stood there together until his breathing steadied, until he turned in her arms and pressed his forehead to hers with whispered gratitude for her presence, for her understanding, and it was in that moment of profound emotional intimacy that Eveline found the courage to tell him what she had discovered just that morning, what she had been waiting for the right moment to share, that she was carrying their child, that new life was growing within her, and Sebastian's expression cycled through shock and wonder and joy so fierce it brought tears to his eyes, and they held each other in the study's lamplight, weeping together now not from grief, but from the overwhelming recognition that healing was possible, that love could redeem even the deepest losses, that from the ashes of his sister's tragedy and her own near destruction, something beautiful and new was being born. The birth came on a morning in late spring, when the world outside Blackwood Hall was alive with birdsong and the scent of blooming roses, and though the labor was long and difficult, Eveline felt Sebastian's presence as her anchor, his hand gripping hers through every contraction, his voice steady and encouraging, even as she saw fear flicker in his eyes. And when the midwife finally placed their daughter in her arms, small and perfect and wailing with impressive vigor, Eveline looked up at her husband and whispered the name they had chosen together, the name that carried both grief and hope: Caroline. Sebastian wept openly as he held his daughter for the first time, this man who had once seemed so controlled and distant, and Eveline watched the last shadows lift from his eyes as he gazed at the tiny face of the child who bore his sister's name, watched redemption work its quiet miracle in the gentle way he touched Caroline's impossibly small fingers, and she understood that they had not replaced his lost sister, but had instead transformed that grief into something life-giving, had proven that love could survive even the cruelest losses and emerge stronger for having endured them. Thomas arrived from London 2 days after the birth, now 20 years old and preparing for his bar examination, his letters filled with passionate discourse about the legal reforms he intended to pursue, and when he held his niece with careful reverence, Eveline saw in him the confident young man he had become rather than the frightened boy she had once tried so desperately to protect, and he told her that he was drafting legislation that would criminalize coercive contracts like the one their father had tried to force upon her, that Caroline's existence, both the aunt she would never know and the baby she was, had given him purpose beyond mere professional ambition. The refuge had expanded in the 2 years since Eveline had first conceived of it. 17 women, now having found sanctuary within its walls, and then moving on to lives of their own choosing, some to employment as governesses or teachers, others to marriages entered freely rather than under duress, and Eveline had learned that healing took many forms, that her own salvation had equipped her to recognize desperation in others and to offer what had been offered to her: time, resources, and the radical gift of choice. It was 3 weeks after Caroline's birth when Eveline's father appeared at Blackwood Hall, having sent no warning of his visit, and Sebastian found her in the nursery and asked quietly what she wished him to do, leaving the decision entirely in her hands, and she felt gratitude for his trust even as she recognized the difficulty of what lay ahead. She met her father in the formal drawing room rather than in any of the spaces that felt truly like home, and when he attempted his rehearsed speech about reconciliation and family bonds, she listened with a compassion that surprised her, seeing him clearly now as a weak man whose choices had been driven by fear and selfishness rather than malice. And when he finished, she told him with quiet firmness that she forgave him for what he had tried to do to her, that she released the bitterness that had once consumed her, but that forgiveness did not require restoration of relationship, that she would not permit him access to her daughter or her life beyond this moment of closure. He left deflated but not entirely surprised, and she felt the final weight lift from her shoulders, the last chain of her old life falling away. That evening, as the sun cast long golden light across the gardens, she and Sebastian walked to the boundary oak, with Caroline sleeping peacefully in her mother's arms, and they sat on the bench he had installed there years ago, the carved initials still visible in the tree's bark, evidence of the girl she had been when she thought freedom meant only escape. And now, holding her daughter while her husband's arm encircled them both, Eveline understood that true freedom had meant something far more profound. The courage to choose love, to build rather than merely survive, to transform pain into purpose and fear into hope. 5 years after their marriage, Blackwood Hall had become something more than a grand estate. It had transformed into a living testament to what love freely chosen could build. And on a golden afternoon in late summer, Eveline stood at the nursery window watching her 3 children play in the gardens she had redesigned, gardens that no longer spoke of formal aristocratic distance, but instead welcomed exploration and laughter, and the particular chaos that small children brought to any landscape. Caroline was 5 now, serious and thoughtful like her father, her dark curls catching the sunlight as she read to her younger siblings beneath the apple trees, and the twins, Margaret and James, just turned 3, tumbled around her with the boundless energy of children who had never known fear or constraint, who had been born into a world of absolute security and love. Thomas had passed the bar 2 years earlier and now worked alongside Eveline in managing the refuge, which had expanded to serve women from 3 counties, and he had successfully championed legislation that criminalized coercive contracts. His passionate testimony before Parliament, drawing on his sister's near destruction and the 17 now 23 women whose lives had been reclaimed through the refuge's intervention. And Eveline felt such pride when she watched him in court, this brilliant young man who had transformed his own helplessness into a force for systemic change. The contrast between this life and that desperate night in her father's study seemed almost incomprehensible now, as though the terrified girl who had stood before a contract that would have erased her humanity belonged to someone else's story. And yet Eveline understood that she was still that girl, that the journey from despair to hope had not erased her past, but had instead integrated it into something larger and more meaningful, had transformed her suffering into purpose. Sebastian found her at the window, slipped his arms around her waist with the easy intimacy of years together, and they stood in comfortable silence, watching their children play, and she felt his kiss against her temple, heard his whispered words, "Thank you for staying," and she turned in his embrace to meet his eyes, those grey eyes that had once been so haunted and were now clear and peaceful, and she corrected him gently. "I didn't stay, I chose. I choose. Every day, I choose this, choose you, choose us." And the distinction mattered because staying implied passivity, implied gratitude for rescue, while choosing acknowledged her agency, her power, her absolute equality in what they had built together. As twilight gathered and they called the children inside, as the lamps were lit and the evening rituals of baths and stories and bedtime kisses unfolded with their familiar comfort, Eveline felt complete in a way she had once believed impossible. And later, when the house had settled into quietness and she and Sebastian sat together in the library where they had first spoken of his sister's tragedy, she thought about that single word that had changed everything, that moment when he had looked at Thorne and her father and said with absolute authority, "No." Dear listener, there is extraordinary power in that smallest of words, in the absolute refusal to permit injustice simply because it wears the mask of legality or tradition or economic necessity, and Sebastian's "no" was not merely a personal rescue, but a declaration that human dignity cannot be bought or sold, that some transactions are too cruel to be tolerated, regardless of the debts owed or the social conventions observed. We all face such moments in our lives, times when we witness diminishment of others or of ourselves, when we must find the courage to say no to what has always been done, no to what is expected, no to systems that treat people as property or obligations rather than as souls deserving of freedom and choice. And perhaps equally important is the courage to accept rescue when it is offered, not as charity, but as recognition of shared humanity, to distinguish between help that obligates and help that liberates, to understand that true freedom sometimes means accepting support while claiming our right to choose what we do with that support. Evelyn's story teaches us that healing is never simple or instantaneous, that transformation requires patience and time, and the gradual accumulation of moments where we are truly seen and valued, and that love, real love, does not seek to possess or control, but rather creates space for another soul to discover and become fully itself. May you find the courage to say no when confronted with injustice, whether directed at yourself or at others, and may you find equal courage to say yes to love when it comes without conditions, to partnership when it offers true equality, to healing when it asks only that you permit yourself to be known. May you recognize your own worth and the worth of every soul you encounter, and may you build a life not from desperation or obligation, but from the sacred power of conscious choice. May your nights be peaceful and your days be filled with purpose, and may you always remember that freedom is not merely the absence of chains, but the presence of love, freely given and received.